Good morning, everybody. Hope you all are doing well. Today, we are going to be looking at Hebrews 12, which is a very big chapter, kind of a long chapter with a lot of stuff in it. And I think I debated going back and trying to go through the whole thing, the whole chapter, but I think I'm just going to go through the first kind of half of it, first section of it, just because I think it would take too much time to go through the whole thing. So we're going to look at Hebrews 12, verses 1 through 14-ish, something like that. And the main section, the main title that you could call this section would be something like Perseverance Through Suffering and Through Hard Times. And so, and this is kind of what the book of Hebrews has been about, like for the whole entire theme of the book is trying to stay strong through suffering. And so I hope this isn't too repetitious, but there are some metaphors and analogies that are used in here that I think are helpful to think about. And this is kind of, you could argue, the climax of the book, or kind of the climax of the message. And so in a certain sense, this is kind of what the speaker or writer is trying to communicate. So remember that Hebrews was written to people who are suffering. They're going through hard times. They're under constant threat for persecution. There are people who would like them dead, who would, just don't like them. There's also fear and threat of ostracism, being isolated, being rejected by your family, by other Jewish leaders, and by a community that you were once a part of. There were people who wanted to kill you. So they were under constant threat of death and all that kind of stuff, which made me think a little bit about some, I guess you could say, fun facts about the psychology of security. So this is a little bit of a side section, fun fact with Josiah Zimmerman about the psychology of some of our personal security, which I think kind of relates, kind of doesn't. But anyway, it'll be fun to hear about. So there's actually kind of a similarity between the constant threat of the people that the book of Hebrews was written to and us. There's also some big differences, but here are some fun facts about our psychology from some studies, generally from 2010 to 2015, something like that. We are a society that has an extremely low pain threshold, whether we like it or not. We view the world now as more threatening than we have since the 1940s and 50s, which, by the way, was like when World War II was happening and the Cold War was happening, and there was like threat of nuclear attack from Soviet Russia, and there was like Nazi Germany and all that kind of stuff. All that to say, we now view the world, and again, this is like 4 years ago or 5 years ago data, but we view the world as more dangerous and more threatening as we ever have, I guess you could say. The tone, this is kind of interesting, the tone of our news sources has significantly declined since 1945, which is, what they mean by the tone is the amount of negative words or positive words that are being used to describe situations around the world. And so what that means is that there are a lot more negative words and a lot less positive words being used. And so basically the world events that we are reading about are being described as much more dire, much more serious, much more life-threatening than they were 50 years ago. Despite declines in war deaths, genocide deaths, homicide deaths, domestic violence, certain forms of child abuse, crime rates, and all of that kind of stuff. There have been steady declines in all of those but there has been a steady increase in our perception of the world as dangerous and threatening, and as high, according to this one study, as high as 82% of people in America think that the world is getting worse, that the world is getting more dangerous. So in other words, we are highly afraid of any form of suffering that we can think of, especially if that suffering is unknown or dreaded, which the dread is usually exacerbated by, as I said, the news media or social media, internet spread, or if the suffering is involuntary, which actually makes sense. All of this kind of makes sense, and you would expect it. But all that to say, we quite understandably hate suffering. And according to Tim Keller, which I guess you could say is an opinion because he's not really a psychologist, but he's a cool guy. He says, we have never been so quick to scream about our suffering. And so I just find it interesting that we are a society now that perceives our world to be incredibly threatening and to be like threats are ever present. They're knocking on our door, and we're just under a constant threat of some sort of bad. At least that's what some of the data is showing, which I just find it interesting because that's kind of similar to what the Hebrews audience was going through, except for their suffering was like their friends were going through it, and it was like beheadings and Colosseum attacks and all that kind of fun stuff. So I'm also not trying to say that the life we live doesn't have suffering. I know that people go through hard times, and actually chapter 12 is all about how life has hard times and suffering. But it's just an interesting, fun side note to think about the fact that whether actual suffering or hard times are happening in our lives, we still perceive them to be happening. And a lot of times that can be just as real to us as what actual reality is saying. So that's the end of fun facts with Josiah. Let's now go into chapter 12. I'm just going to read verses 1 through 14, I think. I might read a little bit more, but for now it's going to be verses 1 through 14 of chapter 12. Therefore, sorry, hold on, let me check something here on my computer. Okay. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have endured. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time, as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Therefore, lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Strive for peace with everyone and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. So that's a fairly long passage. I'm going to touch on some of the main points on that one. There are two main metaphors in this section, and I'm going to go through those metaphors. So it is the metaphor of a race or a contest, and then there is the metaphor of parenting or fatherly care. Let's start with the race. The Greek word that is used for race here is agon, A-G-O-N, agon, and it is where we get the word agony or agonizing. So that's encouraging. And there were several contests that happened in Greek culture and Greek society. And I don't know if it's completely certain which contest this is referencing or if it's just generally referencing a contest, like any contest. Some people think it's a reference to the pentathlon, which is like a huge, I think it was like the final event of the Olympics. And it involved 5 different events. I think it was running, jumping, discus throwing, javelin, and then at the end, a mix between like a boxing and a wrestling match. And some people think it's that because of verse 4. In verse 4, it says something about like you haven't resisted sin yet to the point of shedding blood. And this final wrestling and boxing match that they did in the pentathlon, they wore gloves that were hard on the outside and softer on the inside, so that kind of like boxing gloves, so that when you would hit your opponent, the point of the glove was to try to aid in drawing out blood and disfiguring your opponent. That was the final event. And so some people say this might be a reference to that, like you're in this race, but you haven't yet reached this final event that will disfigure you and draw blood and all that stuff, which is not super encouraging. But this is the term that is being used here to describe our lives, or at least certain events in our lives. That life can be an agonizing struggle. It can be a time of agony. And what the writer is saying here is that suffering is a natural part of life. Going through hard times is a natural part of life. And in a certain way, you could argue that he's saying that it's necessary. Now, it's hard to say that suffering is necessary without saying some caveats. So here I go. Here's some caveats about that. This does not mean that God is like delighting in suffering and that he's like giving this suffering and kind of happy or whatever. You could argue that like in the Garden of Eden, God created the world, and it was actually the human's decision, I guess you could say, to be their own God, their desire for control and to know good from evil and all of that stuff, to be their own God. That was what brought pain and suffering into the world. And then also Jesus, when his friend Lazarus died, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, it says that he was angry at death, and he was angry at the suffering and pain that the people were going through. So I don't mean to say that suffering is necessary in the sense that there's this like kind of dark delight that we should have in suffering. But there is a sense in which suffering is kind of necessary, and this is the way that he uses it in verse 11. In this chapter, verse 11, he talks about training, those who have been trained by this suffering. And that's the word gymnasdo, which is where we get the word like a gymnasium, gym, going to the gym, working out, that kind of thing. And so there is a common thing that doctors seem to say to their patients, and that is you should get exercise. You should get more exercise. Go do more physical exercise. And that's a common thing that, at least in my opinion, and at least a stereotype, the doctors say, go get exercise, get your heart rate up. It's good for you. Try to like get your blood pumping a little bit. And the interesting thing about exercise is that it is putting stress on your body. It's actually, in a sense, ripping your muscles, tearing your muscles, so that the body can heal them again in a way that is stronger and healthier. And I kind of like that metaphor, and that's what he uses in verse 11. He's saying this is like a training, and so in that way, you can think of suffering as kind of necessary. So just like physical pain is necessary to improve your physical health, in the same way, suffering and hard times and stuff like that can be necessary for your spiritual health. And that is if you face the suffering and the hard times in your life in the way that is described here in this chapter. So faith won't really grow if it is not tested. Faith won't really grow unless it's tested. So if you leave the gym after you worked out, after working out or exercising, and you don't really feel tired or weak, that generally will most likely mean that you're not going to get significantly stronger because of that workout. So that's the kind of like switch or like opposition that I'm trying to describe here. So like when I work out, that's a bad example because I don't work out. In the past, when I have worked out, I felt weaker, but I was getting stronger. So in the same way, in the struggles and the hard times of your life, you will feel weak, you will feel discouraged, you will feel like you're lacking in faith, you're lacking in patience, you're lacking in courage to face this stuff. That's how you will feel in the midst of it. But you are getting stronger. In your weakness, you are getting stronger. When you are weak, you are strong. I hope that makes sense. And so that's the kind of training mindset that this chapter has for you. And so this is actually really important to understand. I've talked about expectations before in a sermon, and there's actually some super interesting, the way we deal with expectations are just fascinating. But a large impact of sufferings for us can be our expectations. Tim Keller puts it this way: a large percentage of your pain is not actually your pain. It is the shock, confusion, and self-pity over the fact that it's happening to you. It's your inability to process your unmet expectations. I'm just going to say that again because it's kind of long. A large percentage of your pain is not actually your pain. It is the shock, confusion, and self-pity over the fact that it is happening to you. It is your inability to process your unmet expectations. George MacDonald kind of has a similar saying, which is a little bit harder to understand, but I like it. It says, everything difficult points to something more than our theory of life yet embraces. I'm going to say that again. Everything difficult points to something more than our theory of life yet embraces. So in other words, if suffering, hard times enter your life, and you freak out or melt down or shut yourself down, what George MacDonald is trying to say is that it means that your worldview or your theory of life was not complete because it wasn't robust enough to embrace the reality of suffering. So if something comes into your life and you weren't ready for it, it wasn't something that matched your worldview, it doesn't mean that the suffering was not a part of what should happen to you. It means that your worldview was inadequate to explain or to be ready for this kind of suffering. I hope that makes sense. And this chapter, Hebrews 12, the worldview and the theory of life that this book gives, that this chapter gives, is one that should allow you to be able to stand up in the midst of suffering and hard times. And this kind of leads us into the second metaphor. This first metaphor is a little bit, you could argue it's just kind of harsh. It's just like, suffer through it. It's training. It's like working out. It's not going to be fun. But I think that kind of a worldview is in a sense necessary to understand. That kind of a metaphor is necessary. But the writer switches metaphors here. And he switches from this race training, like gym metaphor, and he goes to a parent-child relationship kind of metaphor. And so from an objective standpoint, you could just say, why did he switch? Because I think the point that he's trying to make makes sense even with this trainer, gym, race metaphor. But he switches, and I think he switches for a good reason. And that is because when you are going through hard times, when you're in the midst of a hard time, something negative that is happening in your life, it is not exactly helpful to think of God as your coach or your trainer who has given you this suffering as like a practice. In the same way that like my basketball coach used to say, like, go do sprints. And so I think for some, it's much more helpful to think of God as a father who is there with you, trying to help you through something hard. Not just this like kind of a little bit more distant coach who's just saying like, keep going. And if you don't do it right, I'll make you do it again, kind of a deal. That's kind of the image I have of like a coach, where it's like, he's just making you do it. You know, it's better for you and it's going to make you a better player, but it's not exactly helpful that he is threatening to make you do it again and all that kind of stuff. So that's why I think he switches to a father metaphor, just because if you are going through hard times, it's helpful to think of God as a father who is there caring for you. And the word that is used in verse 5 for discipline is a kind of a fatherly term. It's the word paideia, and we translate it as discipline, which has now kind of been equated with like punishment, but that's not a good full picture of what the word paideia is. Paideia is where we get the word pediatrics, by the way. And so it has a lot to do with treating a child or trying to act in a way that is for the well-being of the child. And so I hope that helps clarify that it's not just punishment. Other words that could be included in this word paideia would be things like educate, nurture, train, correct, chastise, instruct, that kind of thing. So it involves this like chastise, which you could say is like a scolding or a punishment kind of thing. But it also involves, it has a nurture aspect, it has an educating that aspect, like a training, instruction kind of aspect. And I love the little acknowledgement here about the earthly fathers, but also the heavenly Father. He has this little like caveat in verse 10, where he talks about how earthly fathers disciplined their children as they saw best. I think it's just like, or as they knew best, something like that. I just thought it was an interesting way of him saying like, yeah, I know. Not always is the earthly father punishment good, and not always is it done correctly. There are shortcomings to human punishment and stuff. So I love that he kind of has that little thing in there that's kind of like, yeah, I know. They tried their best. But the Heavenly Father disciplines the one he loves, according to this chapter. And this is not an earthly father kind of payback, retribution kind of discipline, which sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes earthly punishment, fatherly parenting can be like that. There can be anger involved. There can be a desire to get back at the child or something like that. And it's interesting because in verse 8, the writer also says that if you do not receive this discipline, that should be kind of like a warning sign, because that might mean that you are not one of God's children, and like you might be like I think he uses the term illegitimate child. Yeah, illegitimate son. And so there's a certain sense of like, if you're not receiving, if you don't think you're receiving instruction and training and discipline and nurturing care from God, that should be kind of a warning. Like if everything is going well for you, if you're constantly agreeing with everything that, or if the world is constantly loving you and saying everything that you do is great and awesome, and if things in your life are constantly all the time going very, very well, and you don't feel like God is trying to instruct you or teach you in certain things and try to like coach you on the way to live and kind of be there as a father, this verse kind of says that it's almost a warning, like that's not a good sign, because God will punish and train and paideia the children that he loves. Tim Keller, again, he describes the discipline of God this way. He calls it the perfect amount of non-destructive, designed pain needed to prevent selfish, negative behaviors and thoughts. That was long. I'm going to read it again. The perfect amount of non-destructive, designed pain needed to prevent selfish or negative behaviors and thoughts. Kind of like this surgical, it's got just the right amount of pain to attack the bad thing, the sin, the negative part in your life, but not too much that it actually destroys you. And it is designed specifically for you to try to remove the sin and remove the bad thoughts or behaviors that you have. That's how he describes this. And there's examples of this all over the Old Testament. And one of them would be like the story of Joseph, which is Joseph was a favorite child. His dad treated him as a favorite child and spoiled him, gave him all of the child privileges that he could find, gave him this beautiful coat that he didn't give to the rest of his sons. And there was a lot of family brokenness in that family, and you could say that Joseph's father was kind of passing that brokenness down to Joseph, and Joseph was on his way to becoming a fairly self-centered, entitled man who could kind of just continue this cycle of family brokenness in his family. But God came, and this is interesting. God entered into that family, entered into that story, and he used external brokenness to attack Joseph's internal brokenness. Okay, so he used suffering and hard times and a lot of pain and rejection and all of that stuff to surgically remove the selfishness, the pride, and just the self-centeredness that Joseph was beginning to cultivate. So he used the jealousy of his brothers to send him into slavery in Egypt, and he used the lust of Potiphar's wife to force him into prison. He used rejection while in prison to kind of humble him, and in the end, Joseph, at the end of the story, Joseph he's a humble man. He's a wise man. He's a strong leader. He's very wise. And he has I guess you could say, the respect and honor of the entire country of Egypt. And the key point in the story of Joseph is this. At the end of his life, when all of this bad stuff has happened, he's gone through all this suffering, his brothers come to him and they kind of apologize, I guess you could say. They apologize and they say, like, look, our jealousy was bad, all of that stuff. And Joseph goes, no. He says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. You get that mindset? He says, yes, I know there was all this suffering and it hurt. It was painful. It was awful. I wouldn't want to go through it again. But even though it was meant for evil, even though your intentions behind this were hurtful and evil and painful and meant to kill me or destroy me, whatever you were trying to do, God used that for good. And unless you have that kind of a mindset, Joseph's perspective, Joseph's mindset on the hard times that go through your life, on the suffering that you might run into in the midst of your life, in the midst of your journey with God, you won't grow. You really won't grow in your relationship with God. Interestingly enough, in verse 5 of this chapter, there are two other ways that you can deal with this, like, discipline and suffering that is given to you. So there's the way that Joseph had, which is, you meant it for evil, but God has redeemed it and has used it for good. But then there's this one. It says, my son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. So there's two, I guess you'd say, ideas of ways to respond. One is regard lightly, which is kind of like, it's lightening the punishment. It's basically saying, like, I'm not going to let this get to me. I'm going to have thick skin, cross my arms. I'm not going to feel the pain of this kind of suffering or discipline. I'm going to kind of shut myself down. It's a little bit more stoic. It's just kind of like, nope, I'm not going to let it get to me. I was like this as a child at times, not all the time. Sometimes I was. And an example of it would be like, so say I said something hurtful to my brother or sister, or I hit somebody, or I lied, something like that. I did something wrong, and my mom or my dad were like, okay, Josiah, we don't want you to become a lying child, so you lied, that's bad. You can't have a cookie tonight, something like that. And to react in this regard lightly kind of way, sometimes I would say, I didn't even want that cookie anyway. I'm not hungry. I wasn't even going to eat a cookie anyway. Kind of a mindset. Do you see how that's kind of saying, like, yeah, you're trying to punish me, but it's not working. I'm not hungry. I'm not going to eat the cookie. I didn't even want to eat a cookie. So your punishment failed. Haha, take that. That's like an example, kind of an immature, childish Josiah Zimmerman example. Then the other option is be weary. So it says, do not regard lightly and do not be weary. And this, I think, is a little bit more of the modern humanistic way of dealing with suffering and hard times. It's kind of like losing heart, despairing, freaking out, just saying, like, oh, this is awful. This is terrible. How could God allow something like this to happen? And in a certain sense, it's just incredibly egotistic, because it's kind of saying, like, I don't see a reason for this to be happening, and so there can't be a reason for it. How could anything like this happen? This is awful. It's basically saying, like, I am omnipotent. I can see into the future, and I know for sure that this hard thing that I'm going through right now is not helpful, it's not necessary, and it's just an injustice. It's just a problem. Like I can't deal with it. I know for sure that there's not any good that's going to come out of this. This is just awful. Um, that's kind of the be weary. It's more of just like a freak out, shut yourself down, just like I can't stand this. This is too much for me. And so Hebrews says, don't do those two. He says, don't regard lightly. Don't be weary when hard times come, when discipline comes, when God is trying to instruct you through something or to teach you or be with you through something. He's saying, don't regard that lightly. And Hebrews is saying, yeah, don't do any of those. And this is what Hebrews these are the practical things that Hebrews tells you to do in the midst of suffering. And three of them are a lot more practical. One of them is something that will give you the energy to do the practical things. I hope that makes sense. So there's three of them that are more practical, and then there's one other one that without that one, the other three are going to be very, very hard to do. I'm going to start with the three. One is humility. It says, endure hardship as God's paideia. Remember that word, as God's tender fatherly punishment. In verse 11, it says, at the time of the punishment, all hardship and punishment seems like too much. It seems unfair. But later on, it brings fruit. After a while, it brings fruit. And there's a C.S. Lewis quote about this that I really like. And it says this: we shall draw nearer to God, not by trying to avoid the suffering inherent in all loves, but by accepting them and offering them to him, throwing away all defensive armor. There's the humility part, throwing away all defensive armor. If our hearts need to be broken, and if God chooses this suffering or this hardship as the way in which they should break, so be it. Okay, I'm going to read that again. I think it's really good. We shall draw near to God, not by trying to avoid sufferings inherent in all loves, but by accepting them and offering them to him, throwing away all defensive armor. If our hearts need to be broken, and if he chooses this as the way in which it should break, so be it. So there's this spirit of humility that C.S. Lewis has as he faces this suffering that he's going through. And he says, you know, if this is how God is trying to teach me something, if this is how he's trying to change my heart, so be it. I'm going to just give my suffering to him, and I'm not going to despair. I'm not going to reject it. I'm not going to regard it lightly. And I'm also not going to freak out and become weary about it. I'm just going to give it to him and trust in him. And so there's a real sense of humility that I think C.S. Lewis has there. The second thing is endure. This one's a little bit harder to explain because it could come across as just like try harder, but that's not what I'm trying to say. The word is hypomeno, and it means to remain. And it's to remain, and at times you could say it's to remain even when other people have all left and to have given up. So it's like hold firm even if everybody else is giving up and leaving. And the best way I can describe this would be like suffering, going through a hard time, going through an unexpected event can really disrupt you. It can disrupt some of even the simple patterns of your life. It can disrupt your sleeping. It can disrupt your eating. It can disrupt daily habits. It can disrupt the way you do school, the way you do your work. It can make you pray less or read the Bible less. Anyway, it just disrupts you. And I think what this endure word is trying to say is, don't let it completely destroy your entire life. Don't let it disrupt all of your life. In sailing, there's a metaphor. I'm not a sailor, so if any of you guys are sailors and have experience with sailing, correct me if I'm wrong. But in sailing, there's this understanding that if you come across some really bad winds or a storm, the best thing you can do is to go over to your sail or to the wheel, whatever it is that is steering and controlling the boat. You go over to it and you hold on to it. Excuse me. you hold on to it. And if you do this, you will be way less likely to get lost. And you might actually even get to your destination faster. The other option would be to say, oh no, there's a storm, there's bad winds coming, this is not safe. And then you'd run under deck and you just sit there and wait the storm out. That solution, though, puts the storm in total control. It puts, and a lot of times storms will kind of carry whatever is in them further along into them. So if you don't do anything, you might actually remain in the storm for longer, and it might be more of a disruption even. And then who knows where you will be when the storm is over. When everything is done, you have no idea where you will be. So I kind of like that metaphor of like, yes, there's a hard thing happening, but hold firm, stay strong. Don't let the one area where this disruption is happening or where the hard life is happening carry over into other areas of your life. Don't let a work disruption, a work hard time carry into your home, or don't let, I don't know, just hold firm. I mean, I don't know, again, it's hard to explain because you could just take it as like, try harder, but that's not really what I'm trying to say. And this, I don't think, is the only thing that you should do. So I think it's helpful, but I don't think it's something that is like, if you just try harder, all of your hard times will go away or something like that. The third thing comes from verse 1, and that is evaluate yourself. And this one's also really hard to do. In verse 1, it says, throw off your sin, throw off the weight that so easily entangles you. Hard times, when you go through hard times, it brings out the worst of who you are. At least that's how it is for me. When I go through something hard, I become my worst self. I can be really selfish. I can be really self-centered. It can show my idols. It can show my pride. It can show different things that I've been not trusting God in, different fears, lack of trust in community, lack of trust in God, just all of these things. It can show all of these hard, kind of the worst parts of me. And what this is saying is, no, look into yourself, find those things, and get in the practice of asking, okay, Lord, I know this is really hard, but what is it that I should be working on? What is it that you are trying to teach me right now through this thing? I know this is hard, but what are you trying to teach? There's this thing, it's a theory in psychology, sociology, whatever, called the fundamental attribution error. And this is really hard to do because of the fundamental attribution error. And that is basically saying that our tendency is to blame external factors whenever bad things happen to us, and then to blame internal or just the person when a bad thing happens to somebody else. Okay, so that's kind of vague and broad, but here's an example. I'm walking down the street in Columbus, on my street, and I look across the street and there is another person walking across the street. And while I'm watching that person trips on the sidewalk and falls down. My first natural tendency, hopefully my tendency, will be to go over and help the person. But in general, what happens is a lot of people will just say, wow, that guy's clumsy. That guy's uncoordinated. He was kind of stupid to not see the trip hazard on the road or something like that. So the natural tendency when you're just like immediately thinking about a mistake that somebody else did is to blame that person and just say like, it's because of who that person is. But when the same thing happens to me, 10 minutes later on my walk, I trip in the sidewalk and fall down. My first tendency would not be to say, wow, I'm also clumsy. I'm kind of dumb for not recognizing this trip hazard or something like that. My first tendency will actually be like, wow, the city is a really bad city. My taxpayer money is not repairing this sidewalk. That's a problem. That's really annoying. Or why didn't somebody else remove this trip hazard from the sidewalk? Because if they would have just like, instead of walking past it, if they would have just moved it off to the side, I wouldn't have tripped on it You know, it's just these immediate, like, assume the best of who I am. If something bad happens to me, I'm going to look around at external factors to try to find something that I can point it to. And so what this is saying is, no, that might be your tendency, but what you should do is look into yourself, and you should say, okay, what is it that God is trying to teach me through this? What is he trying to point out? And I want to be careful to say that this isn't self-blame, it's self-evaluation. There's a difference there. Don't just blame yourself for everything. That's not helpful. And then finally, and most importantly, this is kind of the main crux of the book of Hebrews, of this chapter. You won't really be able to have the practical humility and endurance and the evaluation of yourself without this one. And that is in verse 2, which says, fix your eyes on Jesus, who left his perfect home, and he came down to us, and he got into the race himself. Okay, he didn't just come as a coach and say, here's ways to help. He got into the race himself. He endured the agon. Okay, he got into the agony itself, and he suffered and he died in his pursuit of us. And so this is saying, look to Jesus. Jesus came and sought us in his suffering, and now we are supposed to return the favor, and in our suffering we are supposed to look to Jesus as our helper and as our author, and as the author and perfecter of our faith. And as we look to Jesus, then we will be able to then self-evaluate. We'll be able to help. It will help us endure. It will help us have humility in the midst of a struggle. And I want to close with a quick story about Jesus, just because I think this helps. This was helpful to me, at least, in thinking about fixing your eyes on Jesus. In John 11, Jesus visits Mary and Martha after their brother Lazarus has just died. So here we go. We've got a hard time. We've got Mary and Martha going through hard time. They're suffering. They're grieving the loss of their brother. So it's a legitimate hard time, you know. And Jesus comes. He comes a couple days late. I think it's like 4 days late. Lazarus has already been buried, and both Mary and Martha, at two separate times, okay, at two separate times, they say the exact same thing to Jesus. They say, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. That's what they say. They're just like, Jesus, if you had been here, Lazarus would still be alive right now. And Martha says it first. Martha runs out to meet Jesus, and when she sees him, says this: if you had been here, Lazarus wouldn't have died. And then later on, when Jesus enters the house, Mary says the same thing. And Jesus has almost completely different, like almost opposite responses to both of these statements, to the same statement, actually. To Martha, he kind of responds, he responds by saying, like, I am the resurrection and the life. He will rise again, okay? And it's this more just like, do you know who I am? Do you trust me? I can deal with this. Kind of a little bit more of like a logical, truth-oriented, like, I am the truth, I am the resurrection, look to me, don't worry about any of this, you know, trust me, do you know who I am? And then to Mary, a couple minutes later, she says the same thing, and Jesus actually doesn't say anything. Jesus, it says he looks around at everybody, and he was deeply moved, and he was troubled, and he wept. He just cried, okay? And you could argue almost that, based on other Mary and Martha stories, that his response to Martha and his response to Mary kind of matched their personalities even. That's a completely different topic. Study. I haven't studied that. I've just done some surface study on that. And you could argue that it makes sense. But what I'm trying to communicate is this, and that is that Jesus knows what it is that you need and will respond accordingly. Okay, you can trust Jesus. When it says look to Jesus, here's why. You can look to Jesus because he's not just this wise guy who when you come to him with a problem, will just like throw the right answer at you and hope it works, not really caring if it will hurt you or if it doesn't, just kind of saying like, here's what you need to know, here's the right answer, just go do this. But he's also not this like empathy machine where he just like sits there and like doesn't say anything to you, just kind of like feels bad for you and is afraid to give any like insight or judgment or thought because it might come across as judgmental or not helpful or hurtful or something like that. Jesus is not either of those. He's both at once, and he is capable of both empathy and truth at the same time. He said it himself. He's like, I am the truth and the life. And you can trust him with your suffering. You can go to him and you can trust that he will give you the response that you need. He will respond with the care that you need, but also the education and the training and the truth that you need as well to get through your suffering and hard times. So that's all I have. Thanks so much.